Good day, everybody. Welcome to our daily reading for A Trail of Broken Dreams. For those of us that kind of forget where we are at in the novel, Harriet's mom has passed away, and she has a younger brother and a younger sister, and this lady, Mrs. Owen, is taking care of all three of them, kind of. She's going to take her younger siblings to Toronto because Dad left a little while ago to go to Cariboo in order to find the gold fields so that he could send money back and basically find their riches. The problem being that Dad is nowhere to be found. Dad doesn't know that Mom has passed away, and she has no idea where in Cariboo he is. So she decided to follow along with a caravan of people that are going to the gold fields. And while she really wants to go with, she's not really allowed to because they don't allow any petticoats or any girls to go along on this trip. Apparently it's only for menfolk. Might be because it takes place in 1862 and times were a little bit different then. She is dressed up as a boy. She is dressed up as a boy because it would be unbecoming for a girl to be alone in the area that she's in right now. She has made it to the town of Cariboo, and she is looking for her father. Most of the people that she was traveling with are gone. They have gone to Victoria for the winter, meaning that they're not going to be mining at this time. And she has just gotten a job in a saloon, which we talked about as a class is a bar where kids are not really allowed, but because she can bake biscuits, the owner thinks that she would be a good fit for this. There's Talbot as well. He is not going to be sleeping in the same stall or horse stable as she is in. He thinks it's not proper. She doesn't think too highly of that. Talbot is sleeping in a wet and drippy tent, freezing cold at night, but it seems like he's being a really good gentleman. We're going to begin reading today in October 4th, 1862, quite late at night, or it's October 5th, early morning, I don't know which. I slipped away from my chores today to beg Talbot to come to the saloon. There was to be a wake for a dead miner, and I figured Talbot could sneak in and eat his fill. And people would think he was there to pay his respects. I asked what he'd do if someone talked about the dead man. I told him to shake his head sorrowfully and look somber whenever anyone spoke of the deceased, and he'd do just fine. For those of you that aren't sure what a wake is, it's a thing that happens when some people die. Used to be that they wanted to make sure that they were dead, and sometimes they made mistakes and they buried people alive, which is a terrifying thought. And so what they did to combat this is that they would have what's called a wake, where they would put the dead person on the kitchen table and then have a big party with that person's money, of course, and then they would try to make as much noise as they could, and if the person wasn't really dead, they would wake up. So here we have a wake being taken place in the saloon where she works. This was my first wake, and not one I'll soon forget. I remember when Grandmother Palmer died, and we all sat quietly around the casket the night before the burying. And Mama's burying was even quicker. But the dead miner was Irish and had a fair amount of money, so the men said he could have a good sending off. The wake began quietly and soberly enough, especially as the priest from the Roman Catholic Church was there. I spent a fair amount of time studying him, as I'd never seen a priest up close before, other than the ones at St. Anne's. The priest's rosy cheeks and clean-shaven chin sure made him stand out from the whiskered miners. And of course his black dress, though old Jackson says it's called a cassock. The room filled up quickly, everyone in town hearing about the free drinks, I expect, and Mr. Mallard was kept on his toes, pouring. I'd been making biscuits all day, and having found some dried apples in the storeroom, made those up into pies. "Goes down real good with this whiskey," one man said as he shoveled more pie into his mouth. He didn't even bother to use a fork, just reached in and grabbed a handful. I saw Talbot hovering by the door, so went over and pulled him in and shoved some biscuits into his pockets before they were all gone. When the food was all eaten, the men started to tell stories about the dead miner, and when they ran out of them, one man said, "Nothing, Charlie, like better than a dance." Charlie was the dead man. And someone brought out his mouth organ, and another his fiddle, and the men began to dance, with each other, as there weren't any women, stomping in their big boots on the wooden floors until the saloon echoed and trembled from the noise. But the worst, and the funniest thing, I must admit, was when the man who suggested the dance pulled Charlie from the casket and dragged him all over the floor for one last dance before the grave. Boys and girls, somebody just pulled the dead guy out of the casket, out of the coffin, and started dancing with him, dragging him all over the floor. Talbot's mouth gaped open, and his jaw fell even further when a glass of whiskey was pushed into his hand. He divided his gaze between the dead man dancing and the whiskey and drained the glass. 3 glasses later, he was up dancing with the rest of the men. October 5th, 1862, later. I never saw the like of it. This morning, most of the men were holding their heads and pushing their breakfasts back to me untouched when a miner came into the saloon, walked up to the bar, and asked Mr. Mallard for a whiskey. In the morning. That brought the men's heads up from their hands. It's uncanny, but these miners have noses like bloodhounds, scenting when gold's around. "There are only 2 reasons to drink whiskey in the morning," old Jackson whispered to me. "To spend your last dollar, and to say goodbye to Cariboo before you return home empty-handed, or to celebrate a find." After a moment, the man who danced with the dead man last night sidled up to the miner and gave him a friendly nod. And then he says, real careless-like, "Haven't seen you in here before. You new to the area?" And the man told him he was, which meant he wasn't going home, so the whiskey was to celebrate. Everyone was alert now, like the place was one big ear listening. The miner suddenly cottoned on to that fact, put down his glass, and hightailed it out of there. The door wasn't shut behind him when every last man, except old Jackson, began whooping and grabbed their hats and coats and stampeded after him. "What about the funeral?" Mr. Mallard shouted. The dead miner's funeral was later that morning, but the men never paused. They had to follow the miner to see where he'd struck it rich. Mr. Mallard told me to clean up and then go do something else for the day, as the place was empty and he guessed he and old Jackson had to go to the funeral. It was as I was turning around with a stack of plates that I saw Talbot standing there. He'd seen and heard everything, and his eyes had that gold fever shine in them. He told me he was going to find his fortune. I'm embarrassed to say that my tongue turned quite nasty from my disappointment at his leaving. "I can't say I saw any nuggets as big as strawberries for the picking." This is something that Talbot had told her earlier on in the book. His face turned beet red, and I knew he recalled boasting about how Cariboo had nuggets to spare. And then I remembered Mama telling me it never does any good pricking a man's pride, and she was right, because I could see right then and there that Talbot was dead set to go, if just to prove me wrong. And if something happens to him, well, there's only me to blame. Too bad I hadn't remembered that before I opened my mouth. Mr. Mallard yelled at me for not shoveling up the mule droppings in front of the door. It seems he stepped right into them. October 8th, 1862. I feel time passing. Winter closing in with every frostbitten night and fallen leaf. We had one real bad snowstorm 4 days back, and it snowed off and on each day since. I remember when we set out from Fort Garry, how long the day stretched into the night, and now it's the night beginning to stretch into the day. Richfield is becoming quiet, as many of the miners leave to winter in Victoria. After the day in, day out noise around here, it seems very strange. Even the saloon is emptying. I know I should be looking for Father. I need to find him soon, or I'll be stuck here for the winter. but I have asked so many people if they know him that sometimes I cannot bring myself to ask another person and hear them say no. It is as if my brain has stopped thinking and my body is too tired to move. I keep reminding myself, I walked over prairies, mountains and rivers to find him, so I better get going. But instead, my hands make biscuits. I'm getting quite well known all over town for them. And I sweep, and I shovel, and I tell myself, I'll search the next day. October 9th, 1862. Snowed steadily all night. I bought myself men's wool drawers from the store with my money from the saloon. I hated parting with the money, but thought it better to get the warm clothing than suffer chills and take a fever. They're very scratchy. October 10th, 1862. I have finally taken myself in hand. At breakfast, I overheard the men in the saloon say that the priest goes along the creeks throughout Cariboo ministering to the miners. He might have seen Father. I'm trying to decide if a Methodist is supposed to talk to a Roman Catholic priest. Perhaps if I'd been more pious, I would have found Father by now. I used to be in the habit of going to services, and now I'm in the habit of not going. A new fault of mine. I paid to send a letter to William and Luella, though I addressed it to the chief factor at Fort Garry, because I was afraid Mrs. Owen might open it, see it was from me, and not tell them about it. I missed them something dreadful. I told them I was real close to finding Father, which I hope I will be by the time the letter gets to them. Evening. I'm so excited. I finally got the nerve up to speak to the priest. His name is Father Alfred, and he was very nice. He said he would put out some inquiries, which strikes me as a much more elegant saying than, I'll ask around. My heart is leaping with excitement. I must remember that phrase, put out some inquiries. I'd like to try that out on Talbot, but of course he's not here. October 11th, 1862. I'm hiding in the shed. I've had such a shock, my legs have the wobbles. I was carrying dirty plates back towards the kitchen when I heard a voice I recognized. John. I quickly ran around the curtain that separates the kitchen from the saloon and peeked out. Sure enough, there he was with his brother. Mr. Mallard is yelling for me, but I'm afraid to come out. I'll wait a bit, and hopefully John and Thomas will be gone. Evening. Father is dead, and I have probably lost Luella and William. I can't stop crying, dear diary. My heart is so sore. I don't know what to do or what will become of me. Very late at night. I do not think I have any more tears in me. I am at a Mrs. McManus's house, as it has been decided that this is the best place for me now that I'm back to being Harriet. I will tell you what happened, dear diary, because I don't feel like I have anyone left in the whole world now except you. John and Thomas had not left the saloon when I went back. They saw me and told Mr. Mallard I was a girl. Mr. Mallard's eyes bulged when he heard of my deception. He was hustling me out of the saloon when we ran into the priest coming in. Father Alfred's face was grave, and right then, dear diary, I knew something bad was coming. Father Alfred told me he had found out that Father had died on Williams Creek 3 days ago of mountain fever. He said no one was sure where the body was at present, but he would find out. Father is dead, and all is lost. She is dressed up as a boy. Don't say Good day, everybody. Welcome to your daily reading for, I'm looking at the wrong spot.